Hello, everybody. This is Sunil Soares from Tavro, and I'm pleased to announce that we're talking today to Val Calvo, who's Vice President of Data Governance and Enablement at Bank United. Welcome, Val.
Hi, Sunil.
So tell us a little bit about your job description and what you do on a day-to-day basis, Val.
Absolutely. So as the Vice President of Data Governance and Enablement at a mid-sized bank, as you can imagine, I wear a couple of different hats. My role is primarily focused on helping to harness our data transformation strategy, which not surprisingly is linked to business data enablement. As you can imagine, like many of us involved in data right now, and as I expect you're going to ask me about, AI plays a very large focus in what's keeping me busy from a data governance perspective and also from an AI governance perspective. But in a nutshell, essentially, my responsibilities fall towards enabling the business to access well-governed, trusted, and accessible data.
Excellent. So it sounds like you own both data and AI governance for the bank.
I do, yes.
Excellent. So today I wanted to talk to you about data risk, right? Often bandied around in banks for the longest time. So I'll start with a basic question about what is data risk?
So if I were to define data risk for you, I'd essentially frame it as the potential for loss, misuse, or harm resulting from essentially poorly governed or ineffectively governed data. This may manifest in poor data quality. It may manifest in ultimately inadequate controls, but it's essentially the very pinpointed risk that is associated with ultimately the lack of governance around enterprise data.
Does this matter from a regulatory perspective as well, Val, with data risk?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think it matters perhaps almost most importantly from a regulatory perspective is making sure when you are in a regulated space, as I am right now in a mid-sized bank, our regulators are certainly honed in to the aspect of data risk, and that's only growing around the evolving landscape for AI.
Excellent. Now, where does data risk fall within the overall risk taxonomy, speaking from a geek perspective, right? With,
Absolutely.
Risk taxonomy.
From a geek perspective, this is firmly in the operational risk category. Look, it definitely blurs into some of the other aspects as well, but for me, I put this squarely in operational risk.
Excellent. So now, when you think about data risk, I know historically, you're thinking about the CISO and information security risk, but can you just talk about the different components of data risk from your perspective?
Absolutely. So yes, the information security is usually the one that people are most aware of, but from a geek perspective, again, data quality is something I mentioned earlier. That is a big one. So really understanding the risk that arises from inaccurate, incomplete, inconsistent data, essentially. So making sure that you can speak to your quality controls, your standards, and stewardship. Metadata and lineage is another one that stands out. Again, being able to speak to how data travels from source to target, being able to understand what things mean, who they matter to, who's ultimately responsible. Also things around usage. Again, from an enablement perspective, understanding what data is fit for purpose for, how it's intended to be used. And again, now thinking about AI use cases, what data is truly ready for AI, and how you manage that from a risk perspective. So I could talk about this for hours, but I think, again, hopefully that provides a good bird's eye view of at least the specifics of data risk beyond just information security.
Awesome. So when you're thinking, basically what you're saying, right, when you're thinking about data controls, it's not just information security controls, but controls relating to data ownership, data governance, data quality, data usage, metadata management. Excellent.
Exactly. And controls becomes, I think, the most important part, again, from a governance perspective, but also from a risk perspective.
Perfect. So just circling back a bit, you know, given your deep practitioner experience in banking and financial services, why have banks been historically focused on data risk?
Absolutely. So if you think about the landscape of data within banks, an area where banks have been focused for quite some time relates to model risk and really some of the more traditional AI when you think about the algorithms and the models that have already been in place around banks and have already been heavily regulated. That's where banks tend to have spent a lot of their time, and they understand that landscape around model risk and all of the regulatory aspect that comes along with it. The landscape is evolving now, as you can imagine, but that's where the regulation has typically come into, to understanding that when banks make financial decisions, when they make credit decisions, that ultimately that is based by a model that they can explain, that's transparent, and that ultimately someone is accountable for. Again, as you can imagine, it becomes a springboard to many conversations around data and AI as well.
Awesome. So basically model risk management, MRM, that's been historically the focus of data risk, but now it's extending to AI.
Exactly.
AI introduces more than just predictive learning, predictive models.
Exactly right. Yes.
Excellent. So now let's talk about, data risk has been going on for a while. You alluded to this earlier. Why is data risk so important in this new world with AI and especially AI agents?
Absolutely. So AI has been it's been so helpful for us that are in the data governance space specifically, because look, data governance is a conversation that at times is hard to have with senior leaders who are outside of the data world, trying to explain to them why this matters, what's in it for them. AI has been the great conversation starter, as I call it, where executives are already excited about AI in a way that they don't necessarily get excited about data, and they don't get excited about data governance. So it's allowing us to have much better conversations with leadership, whether they are technically inclined or not, to really understand the value of governed data and the value of truly harnessing data risk. To understand, again, not all data is AI ready. We try not to speak in kind of catchphrases. And again, we want to make sure that we're kind of fully explaining everything we can to our stakeholders, but getting to the understanding of what truly AI ready data is, and what some of the non-negotiables are, has been really important and has been a game changer, at least from a data governance perspective, because it brings people to the table willing to talk about the things that before they would argue they didn't have time for, that were maybe nice to have but not need to haves, now become need to haves in the AI space, when you really think about, again, how you're able to, from a regulatory perspective, from a risk perspective, speak to the landscape of your AI use case, the landscape of your AI data. It really all starts to come together around risk.
I was talking last week with somebody, AI itself creates imperatives, but AI agents make it an even bigger concern. Can you talk a little bit about, we talk about data risk, maybe it's information risk, but what are some of the challenges you'd face around AI and AI agents when you think about unstructured data and the challenges with unstructured data and data risk?
Absolutely. So if I take the question in two parts, first around agents, I think one of the areas where, the risk becomes a bit heightened at times around agents is the aspect of accountability, and ownership. So when we think about risk, when we think about governance generally, we think about ultimately having someone responsible and involved in the process, whether a data owner, a data steward, an individual who can ultimately speak to the data. The same thing exists in AI, and where agents change the game a little bit is it tends to, at times, remove a human in some ways and allow for some autonomous decision making that, again, if you are risk averse, may make you very nervous. So being able to frame, again, what is in the appropriate level of risk for whatever organization you're in, but especially in a regulated industry, understanding what sorts of risks you can accept, in terms of, again, you're not going to find a bank at this point using agents to make credit decisions by any means. I think I can go out on a limb there. But again, acknowledging that agents certainly do bring a new level of risk. But again, I think it is sometimes an information gap, and having people truly understand what the agents are doing and how a human in the loop, or at least some level of accountability, still factors in terms of those agents. The second part of your question, as it relates to, again, unstructured data, this is a big one. Again, I think acknowledging the evolving landscape, again, working in an organization that is focused on data modernization, as you can imagine, unstructured data is really the magic of where this happens. But it's an area that often requires or has the least amount of governance, but requires the most amount of oversight by my group and my team. It is certainly an area that's bringing more people to the table to really get involved in conversations they wouldn't have been before. So again, we talk about AI being the equalizer. I now have stakeholders who actually understand that their data is unstructured and understand the challenges that that provides or that presents to us. So again, I think it has been really awesome that AI and agents and you name it, just the evolving landscape here has really brought a lot of people to the table. But unstructured data brings its own host of challenges. But again, I think most organizations are dealing with these at the same time.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, give you a little anecdote from my own personal experience. I live in Florida and we have a lot of HOAs, homeowners associations. And I was talking to a company that manages HOAs and they decided to create a chatbot, right? Instead of having customer service reps speaking to people, they had a chatbot and they put the chatbot on top of a lot of these PDFs. So for example, someone in one of the residents said, what are the opening hours for the swimming pool? And as you can imagine, because you had all these inconsistent PDFs, you got inconsistent responses to what the opening hours for the swimming pool are. So they had to go and fix the PDFs. So that's a great example of, an agent or chatbot uncovering inconsistencies in unstructured data.
And ultimately a data quality issue. Yes, exactly. And I think what organizations are finding in this space is that they have a lot of work, not going back to the concept of AI ready data, even when you have documents that you may think are official policy documents and are kind of the most ready for this sort of work. What you're realizing is that, we often have multiple versions of the same thing and we don't necessarily think about how we update them and what the structure looks like when we update it. So again, I think it's forcing us to take a closer look at many aspects of our data, especially in the unstructured space. When you think about even our well-formatted, most official documents still have some work to do as it relates to the opportunities that AI presents.
Excellent. So anything else that you wanted to provide, Val, or any key takeaways for the audience that you wanted to share?
No, I think my biggest thing is that, again, acknowledging, we all talk about AI being the game changer, but again, I think anything that we can do that ultimately from a data governance perspective and truly from a risk perspective as well, that allows the business to better understand the challenges that we're facing, to frame it in such a way that gets them almost excited. Like I said, these are sometimes difficult conversations to have. As someone who's passionate in the space, I could talk about this, like I said, for hours, and I'm happy to be here talking about it, but it's a much tougher conversation with some of our stakeholders. So again, I think the biggest thing is to lean into what's exciting them and to be able to harness, again, it's an untapped opportunity, but it's also an area, especially in a regulated space, where you've got to be really mindful of risk. But there's certainly opportunities abound. And again, anything we can do to ultimately have data better governed at the end of the day is a win in my book.
Excellent. So once again, Val Calvo, Vice President of Data Governance and Enablement at Bank United. Thanks so much, Val, for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Sunil. Pleasure to be here.